Welcome to History Happy Hour. I'm your host, Jess Edberg, Executive Director of the Dorothy Molter Museum, and I'm here tonight to educate, inspire, and entertain you with a pint-sized historical tale related to Ely Area history and about the time it takes to drink a pint of ale. If you are new, the history I share is not a deep dive, rather it scratches the surface using publicly accessible resources. History Happy Hour is supported in kind by all of these wonderful supporters, and it really would not happen without them. You can also find past episodes and playlists online. So, what does the title of this program mean? Black History in the Northland? If you were like me and others I've spoken with in the last few weeks, the education we received in high school on Black history focused on the Civil War and our great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln, along with Reconstruction and how Jim Crow laws and segregation were, quote, solved with the Civil Rights Act. It was sorely lacking in any type of history related to Black, Brown, or Indigenous people other than generalized topics related to enslavement and treaties as the United States was being settled. Tonight, we're going on a shared journey with my special guest, Regan, to truly understand that there is Black and Brown history in the Northland of the Ely area, as well as who those people were. And of course, this lack of historical knowledge on Black history extends across North America. This is why we have a Black History Month. As I emphasized in last month's program, the tendency of people in power controlling the narrative is a problem. It limits the preservation of whatever oral histories are being shared and what documentation of history is valued and saved. It's no secret that stories, lived experiences, conflicts, and achievements have been suppressed throughout history. Racism, xenophobia, and misogyny are intersecting systems of oppression that reinforce each other to produce compounded discrimination that is mirrored in how we preserve or remember history. For this very reason, Carter G. Woodson, a Black historian and founder of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, pushed for a Black History Week in the 1920s. Not only for African Americans knowing their own history and giving people a sense of belonging and community, but also for making Black history available to all Americans and making it an acknowledged part of American history. Woodson knew that African Americans had been written out of periods in U.S. history, and designating a week in February to commemorate Black history meant that there would be efforts to reclaim it and preserve their place in it going forward. For decades, Black History Week gained recognition mostly within Black institutions, such as historically Black colleges and African American newspapers, but the expansion from a week to a month grew out of the persistence of teachers to institutionalize teaching Black history. Right around the time in the 1970s that teachers also pushed for Women's History Month. Clearly, there is much work to do. University of Minnesota history professor William Jones summed it up best by saying the whole purpose of Black History Month was to call attention to an aspect of American history that's been overlooked and ignored. And the idea that it would be something that is objectionable or not in line with the policies of the federal government is a strange development. So we gather tonight to amplify some Black histories that you may or may not be familiar with. How many of you have heard the name George Bonga? Bonga may be one of the more well-known Black figures in our Minnesota history. Predominantly known as an interpreter, fur trader, and guide, Bonga, who was born in 1802, is believed to be one of the first Black people born in what became the state of Minnesota. He was born near Duluth to Pierre Bonga, an African-American, an Ojibwe Kwe, an Ojibwe woman. On a side note, George Bonga's mother's actual name isn't Ojibwe Kwe. The word Ojibwe Kwe means Ojibwe woman, and there is little documented history for her. George Bonga's grandfather, Jean Bonga, had been brought to Mackinac Island after the American Revolution by a British officer, either as an enslaved or indentured servant. After the officer died, Jean Bonga was released from his contract and gained his freedom. George Bonga's grandfather and grandmother became fur traders, passing on this trade to Bonga's father, Pierre, who became a fur trader and a guide for explorers. This knowledge and experience was then passed on to George as he grew and traveled with his parents across Minnesota. Before the fur trade industry petered out, George Bonga worked his way into a respected position in northern Minnesota. Known for his incredible size, strength, and navigational knowledge of the region, he was also highly educated and multilingual, speaking English, French, and Ojibwe. Bonga's name became a household word, both as a hero and as a traitor, when in the bitter cold of January 1837, he captured an Ojibwe man accused murderer after tracking him for 6 days, resulting in the first criminal trial in Minnesota history. As the fur trade dissolved, he and his wife, Ashwin, along with their 4 children, switched to tourism and operated lodges at Leech and Ottertail Lakes. His impact on northern Minnesota was so great, Bungo Township in Cass County is named after George Bonga's family. George Bonga was one of only 14 African Americans counted in Minnesota Territory in the 1850 census. This number is likely inaccurate due to the tendency of people being classified as either Indian or non-Indian, especially at treaty signings. He used his notoriety to fight for the rights of Native Americans, helping negotiate terms, and served as the official witness to the treaty signing that established the White Earth Indian Reservation in 1867. George Bonga passed in 1872, but his history, at least, has not been forgotten. Another important and historically significant Black story in Minnesota is that of Dred and Harriet Scott. Dred Scott was born into slavery in 1799 Virginia state to the slaveholding Peter Blow family. The family moved to Missouri and took Scott with, where he was then sold to Dr. John Emerson, a military surgeon. Dr. Emerson moved north and bounced around military posts, all located in areas where slavery was prohibited. At Fort Snelling, Dred Scott met and married Harriet, who was also enslaved. Eventually, Dr. Emerson moved back to Missouri, and after his death, Dred and Harriet Scott turned to the courts for their freedom. In 1846, they started a decade-long fight to recognize their time living in free states. In an infamous majority decision written by Chief Justice Taney, the court held that as a slave, Dred was not a U.S. citizen, was therefore not entitled to sue for freedom in federal court, had never been free, and had to remain a slave. Going further, the court ruled that the anti-slavery provision of the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. They were enslaved again by the Emerson family, but when the matriarch remarried, her new husband was against slavery, and the Scotts were granted their freedom in 1857. The reality is that Black history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, has been our shared history in Minnesota for easily over 2 centuries. A few more notable tidbits include the Missouri Pilgrims escaping enslavement with the help of Minnesota-based steamboats in May 1863, who established the first Baptist church in Minnesota. The first political convention advocating for voting rights of Black Minnesotans in 1869. The first Black person, John Wheaton, elected to the Minnesota legislature in 1898. And the Afro-American Women's State Federation Convention in Duluth in 1906. These stories are of many challenging the common misconception that Black people in Minnesota came here during the Great Migration. The Great Migration refers to the approximately 6 million Black people who moved from the American South to northern, Midwestern, and Western states roughly from the 1910s until the 1970s. The driving force behind the mass movement was to escape racial violence, pursue economic and educational opportunities, and obtain freedom from the oppression of Jim Crow. However, we now know that there were many other Black individuals and families who chose to come to Minnesota to farm and work in booming industry towns, including Ely. Part of the challenge of putting together an accurate picture of Black history in the Northland is understanding historic record-keeping practices, such as how Black and Brown people were listed by census takers. For example, if a person of color appeared to look like what folks at the time considered, quote, white, they may have been recorded as such. There's also the reality that some records were intentionally skewed or omitted entirely. To share more about this, I'm honored to pass this mic torch to Regan.
Thank you, Jess. So this first picture is a photograph of the state of Minnesota. And last year we had did a presentation and it identified, so all the green dots identify all the counties that we found early African Americans in. The purple dots are counties that we found at least one, but we haven't been able to do the full county yet. We found at least one African American living there before 1900. And then the blue dots on the surrounding counties in Wisconsin, Iowa, North and South Dakota is just some of the migration patterns of people that were either in Wisconsin first that came to Minnesota, or they have moved from Minnesota into those surrounding counties. So in regards to St. Louis County, I'm so glad that Jessa brought up Mr. George Bonga. A lot of people think it was only him that was in the county. But in 1857, there were at least four other families other than the Bonga family living in St. Louis County. In 1870, there were at least 25 Black people living in St. Louis County. 1880, about 13. 1890, 228. 1900, about 370, and 1910, about 439. Though a lot of them were in the Duluth area, they were also living in Virginia, Eveleth, Tower, a little bit of all over the range. In doing this research, some of the interesting things that we found out about Ely. So though I don't have specific names for the early African Americans in Ely, we did find some interesting information. There was um, a a project done about life on the Vermilion Range before 1900, and it had mentioned that in 1891 that there were multiple Chinese laundries and at least two Negro barbershops, and that was in the Ely Times. One of the other interesting things that came out from that is a specific news clip that said, a Black gentleman who is victim of nearly all misfortune that could befall one is upon our street today. He is minus one arm, has a broken limb, and is entirely blind. Though the article did not mention him by name, I am destined to find him to find out more about this man that clearly, if anyone came across him, they would probably have something to say about him. And because the newspapers of that time were so specific and colorful in their language, we are pretty certain that he is not one of the gentlemen that we found in the area living later on because there is no mention of these different misfortunes that he has. And one of the other interesting things that I found in regards to Ely was in 1895. So there was an item called the McCandless Concert Company, and they performed at Finn Hall. So what's interesting about them is that the McCandless was the concert company was from William McCandless, and William was born enslaved in 1858, and he attended the Cincinnati College of Music. He was potentially the chief musician for U.S. Army Ninth Cavalry. He might have toured in Europe and Australia. And he was previously in Minneapolis in 1885, and he played for the Scandinavian Total Abstinence Society. So I'm thinking maybe someone from that who attended that was instrumental in bringing him to Ely. But what's interesting about the newspaper articles about him and his concert company being in Ely is that the Vermilion Iron Journal. So they played in Ely and then they played in Tower afterwards. And it said, the company is a very good one and deserved better patronage. At Ely on Monday night, they played to a full house. So it felt kind of nice seeing something there that Tower was upset that Ely updid them. And Ely had more participants at this event. So a lot of our focus is going to be on the families that I found in the Tower area. And some of them lived there just for a short time, and some had lived a little bit longer. So Scott Straws, he was only there for about 2 years so far that we could find. He was a barber there, and he was also a landowner. So what happened, what caused him to leave is There was an incident in 1892 with A.R. Palmer here at the bottom of the screen. Him and a gentleman, as the newspaper says it, they exchanged compliments with 38 revolvers. So A.R. Palmer was a black man and apparently had some incident with a white guy that was living in Tower area. And from that incident, Scott Straws started getting threats that he should leave the area. So Scott did leave. He ended up going over to the Grand Rapids area and starting another barber shop. And one of the interesting things that I found in regards to the newspaper about Scott leaving, and especially in this time frame, because sometimes you can find a lot of negative information, but the Vermilion Iron Journal said in 1892 about Scott leaving, it said it should be just as safe for a black man to reside in Tower as in any other city on the globe. And the journal believes Mr. Shaw's made a mistake in going away if he went solely because of threats to do him harm. So that gave me some feel good just about the area that they acknowledged that he was getting threats, but he had to be at least respectable enough that they didn't want to see him leave and they felt that he should be able to live wherever he wants. William Baird was the first one I found in Tower, at least first so far. He arrived about 1887 and he was a barber as well. He had been in Duluth or in Minnesota at least since 1883, and a lot of that time was in Duluth before he came to Tower. He married in Tower in 1888, and then some of his barbering time was with Tom Taylor, that's listed at the top. And so William was here until at least about 1900. 1895, he wasn't living with his wife anymore, but he was still living in Tower. And he was at least respected enough because he was paid by the city of Tower a few times for galvanizing the boiler. And then unfortunately, William passed in 1904 in Duluth. And there are records or newspaper articles about Tom Taylor visiting or going to Duluth to visit William before he passed. The two families that were here the longest are the Nichols family and the Taylor family. John and Nora Nichols, so John was a chef and Nora was a homemaker for a while until John passed, and then she started her hand at the restaurant business as well. So John died pretty young. He died about age 41. But they were married in Tower as well. They were married around 1894. Nora Nichols is initially or originally Nora O'Brien. So John was black and Nora was an Irish immigrant. They had at least two kids who died really young. John Jr. died about two years after John died. John Sr. died. And in the papers, when John was going through his ailing health, it said that because of his health issues that he had left the family destitute, and that when he passed, Nora had 7 children that she was attempting to care for on her own. But while John was alive, he was renowned. He was a chef at Vale Hotel in Ely. He was a cook at the Vermilion Hotel, and he also cooked for the election board. Their son, one of their sons, went to Ely to appear before the draft board. And then he joined some black soldiers leaving Duluth for Camp Dodge in, I believe, Iowa or Missouri. And then the older sons ended up going to Duluth as well. And the older sons actually ended up being roommates in Duluth with Thomas Taylor's older son. And Tom and Frances Taylor, they were in Tower the longest. So they got there about 1888. In 1889, Tom had the OK Barbershop with William Baird. Tom also had 2 land patents. So one in 1889 and another in 1909. And there is said that there's Taylor Island in Lake Vermilion is named after Tom. So Tom and Frances had at least 5 children. but three of them died before age 5. One of them did make it to adulthood till about 24. Her name was Zany. And then their son, Donald, he was the only one that lived into older age. He made it to about 80. The unique thing about Tom is, so he was a member of the Vermilion Club, also the Old Settlers group. He hunted, he was a singer, he was part of the Vermilion Range Master Barbers Association. Um, and looking at some oral interviews that we found on the Beaufort Heritage site, they had mentioned that Frances apparently had a song or a voice of an angel, and she was regularly requested to sing at weddings. And in the Life and Time, the book, The Life and Times of the Vermilion Club, I really like kind of the tribute that they gave to Tom. So from the book, it says, it may be said for us that in the practice of our fellowship, we, not realizing, rise above creeds and are tolerant about them. We have in our fold a fellowship, Catholic and Protestant, Jew and Gentile. Tom Taylor, whose skin is black as night, who had a golden heart and was once one of us and still is one of us in spirit. So sometimes we get the questions on what's the process and kind of what's the challenges that we go through. So the process is just kind of starting very old school, page by page census. So we start with the 1857 census, start on page 1. We pick a county and, pick the first city in that county, and it's this whole process going page by page. The reason we do this is when we start, we don't know the names. So before I started this, I had no idea who Tom Taylor was, who John Nichols was, or Scott Straws. So we page by page and we look for the racial designations to determine if we found early Black residents. Then once we find the names, then we can add them to our massive ever-growing tree in Ancestry, and then we can start following them forwards and backwards. So we follow them forwards to understand how long did they stay in areas and understand migration patterns if they left. And then once we have that, then we can start digging in the newspapers to have a better understanding of what their life was like when they were in these areas. So challenges, yes, of course, we definitely come into that a lot. One of the biggest challenges is misindexing, and this is why we do page by page census. So page by page census, it's not just kind of looking at what the computer or someone transcribed at the bottom. It's looking at what was actually written on the census. So misindexing can occur. It really depends on, was it a human that did the index? Was it a machine? And what were the instructions given? But there are plenty of times where we've seen Black residents where we can clearly see on the census, it says B for Black, and they are indexed as white. We also see a lot where if we do a quick search, there might be a C in the field, and depending on who's reading the census, they might put the racial designation as Black because they think the C means colored, which was the term used at the time. But reading the census itself, I can clearly see that the person's Chinese because they were born or their parents were born in China. So there's a lot of misindexing. So it takes time because we'll correct those as we go along. But that's why we can't just do a quick search and trust the information. We have to see the actual census and review it with our eyes so we can make the actual judgment on what it is or not. The other one would be access to records. So once we have names, it's right, are there newspaper records or were they in the newspapers at all? Are the newspapers digitized? Do we have access? Um, do we have to go to these locations to find the newspapers if it's if it's not digital and things to that nature? And sometimes the challenge is just the terminology that you come across. I've been doing it for a long time, so some of it is easy for me to bypass, but there's still times that it's like, oh, wow. I did not expect that at all. So let me take a breather and let me step away and let me process a little bit before I get back to reviewing the census or the newspapers. So why is this important and what work still needs to be done? So important for multiple reasons. There's a lot of erasure in history in general, but definitely there's a lot of stories that people just don't know. Um, I've traveled all over and people have been surprised like, wow, you're Black and you're from Minnesota. There's Black people here. And this is, in today's day and age or the last 20, 30 years, let alone people are usually surprised that there have been black people here, since statehood. Um, but me starting specifically in St. Louis County, I grew up on the range. I went to school in Virginia, Gilbert, lived in Eveleth. Our family still has land in Mackinac. But when I was in school, it could be kindergarten through eighth grade. I'm the only Black student at the school. Yeah, I have cousins and things like that, but they were older, so I was never in the same, like if I was in elementary, they were already in junior high. So it was just me. And doing the research now, knowing how many people walk this land before me that look like me, it's just like, wow, if I would have known that in elementary school, like what could that have done for my esteem or just how I kind of felt like my belonging? Other work still needs to be done page by page of the state. We are slowly bringing on more volunteers, but page by page census work is not for everyone. And it takes a long time. I won't even tell you how long ago I started on St. Louis County, and I'm not done yet. But I did, I did choose the county that has the largest land mass in the state. So I try not to beat myself up that I haven't done it yet or that I'm not completed yet. But from what I found so far, I'm over 320 and I'm still on 1895. So got a ways to go. And yeah, I'm probably going to get to 400 easy. So not only are we going the federal census, which happens about every 10 years, we're also doing the state census as well. So then we can kind of track everyone in about a 5-year increment. And then newspaper, definitely a lot of newspaper research to be done once we have kind of built out the person's timeline. But then there's other stuff, writing articles to get exposure, writing bios. So whoever comes on new can kind of get a feel of who this person was, even if we don't have a lot of information for them. All right. I'll hand it back on over to Jess. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your expertise and research with us tonight, Reagan. Like I say every program, local history is everyone's history. Your engagement and support of tonight's program gives forgotten voices of this shared experience of history a voice. And thank you for being here. Very special thanks to Regan Richardson and Anders Genealogical Services for their incredible knowledge and assistance in making this program a success. Please join us next month to learn more about our shared history when we focus on Ely's historic State Theater.